Good evening. Not sure if anyone's out there, but drop us a line if you are. I'm going to start, this is the first of hopefully many live videos on some of the basics of reloading, on this occasion just metallic rifle cartridges. And any questions through the video, please feel free to drop me a line and I'll try and answer them. I've got an iPad and I can hopefully see the messages at the same time as I'm giving the video. So I'm just going to dive right in. The first thing I'm going to do is just run through some of the basic names and functions of the cartridge itself. I'm going to use this one because it's got a cutout, but a simple rifle cartridge is predominantly a bottleneck cartridge because of the change in diameter and the overall outside diameter. This section here, the neck and the shoulder, the body of the cartridge going down to the head complete with head stamp in this case. The head is not the bullet. The bullet is often called heads by people either online, you see them advertised as heads. Technically that is the head at the end of the cartridge here where the primer is seated. You'll also see inside that actually that's a very thick section of the rifle cartridge itself. This one is very neatly turned into a bottle opener for somebody. The aspect of the cartridge when it is fired is the thing that's most fundamental to what we're going to do today. I'm going to show you this cartridge, which is actually seated in the chamber of a 243, and you can see the protrusion from the back of the tenon on this barrel. That's how much your cartridge is sticking out when it's inside the chamber. And your bolt, when it's on the cartridge, will almost touch the back of the chamber, but not quite. The process that happens when you pull the trigger, the firing pin comes through the bolt and forces the cartridge into the chamber. Now the gap between the face of the bolt here and the back of the head of the cartridge here is the headspace. That's a critical dimension that has to be there for a number of reasons, but if it's too big it can cause problems. When you're sizing this case, and when we go through it later I'll explain why that headspace is important. If you make that case too small, when the firing pin hits it, it pushes the case far too far into the chamber. The next thing that happens when the firing pin hits the primer is obviously it ignites the primer and sets off the powder charge inside. The pressure builds up in that case. This is all happening in microseconds, milliseconds, and it will seal the neck of the case. So you can see just around here there's a line of carbon. Some of these cases are a little bit easier to see. That is showing you where the neck is sealing in the chamber itself, and the case will grip the inside of the chamber. When people are cutting chambers, they don't want to cut them too smooth, because if there's no grip, the cartridge won't seal effectively, and it won't take the form of the chamber in the order that it's meant to happen. The order is this seals, and then the case will actually grow back into the headspace, and it will fill the void between the bolt face and the head of the cartridge here. So in effect your cartridge is growing every time you pull the trigger, and that's another thing that's significant when you're sizing them. I've got a diagram here of the technical specification of a chamber, and you can see on here there's the shoulder of the case here. You can see that the neck of this particular case stops there, and then there is a chamfer in the chamber. Then this section here is the lead, where the rifling and the taper from being just a straight tube down to the bore, which doesn't start till you're about here. This feature in the rifle, in a factory rifle, is set so it can accommodate the longest possible bullet that you could buy in any factory chamber. So for example, if you were buying a 308, that section of the chamber is so long it can accommodate up to a 200 grain bullet, even though you might be shooting a 150 grain bullet. Again, I'll touch on how the proximity of the bullet to the rifling on that a little bit later on. When that cartridge goes off, it will fill the void between the size of the side of the chamber and the wall of the case. So this section here, the neck is sealing up here, a cartridge is growing back, and as it fully expands, it fills that, and the case itself will butt up against the shoulder. The dimensions of that cartridge are specific to the chamber, which has a certain tolerance size. So all chambers are pretty much the same size. The spec of that chamber, you can find these online, and you'll see that on here there is a datum point on this cartridge, which is about halfway up the shoulder. That datum point is a specific length, and it tells you where on the cartridge that is, and that's where your headspace is measured. So if you've ever bought any of the Hornady headspace measuring tools, that's the point at which they're measuring your case. It's usually done on a fired case, so you can get a better idea of the size of your chamber. Now the chamber itself has a specification which is plus or minus a particular size. They're not all the same size, in the same sense that if you buy a pair of size 9 shoes, they're not always going to be exactly the same size for you. If you had a rifle that was cut as the first cut of a chamber reamer, the reamer's at its absolute largest size, so your chamber is slightly bigger than the last chamber that was cut with that reamer, which might be a very small amount, slightly smaller. So again, I'll touch on that when we're setting the die up to size the case, as to how that works. So we've got a case, it's been fired, it's come out of our rifle, it's going to look like that. Struck primer, nice clean strike there. What are we doing when we are reloading? Well, primarily we want this neck, which is now bigger than a bullet. So if you put a seat a bullet in there now, it would just drop straight in. We're looking to size that neck back down, usually within about 2 thou less than the diameter of the bullet. The dies that you use, and it doesn't matter whether you use Lee dies, Redding dies, Forster, or whatever they are, they're set up to accommodate that size of neck, and they will push the neck and crush the neck down into a size that will be roughly 2 thou less than the bullet, and that's the tension in the neck that you're going to get. The other thing that you will be doing if you full length size the case is knocking this shoulder back so that you get back down to the factory spec, which allows that headspace gap at the end. Now that's a factory tolerance, so if you set the die up as they expect you to, you're going to get the same size of case length overall from that datum point on here to the head on the case each time, every time. You'll get very smooth chambering, and your case will fit into pretty much any 243 rifle because you've brought it back down to factory spec. The alternative is if you use a neck sizing die where you literally only size the neck. There are 2 or 3 different ways to do that. The Redding dies, for example, those ones there, they use a bushing inside, which is just literally forcing that neck into a bushing that is roughly 2 thou less than the outside diameter of your case. Other dies, for example, the Lee collet die, which will be that one there, when you compress the arm on the press, it will squeeze the neck in a collet. So it's just literally gripping it from the outside in a lateral movement there. There are all sorts of things written on why you should neck size and why you should full length size. I'm going to try and give you some of the basics here. If you want to take this to F-class level of reloading, then there are all sorts of things that you could do to incorporate this. But what I'm trying to cover is a lot of the fundamentals so that you are able to set up a die, not screw up the brass, and get a safe and repeatable load. A lot of people are reloading for cost. Maybe the round of choice is very expensive, but you can buy reloading components, the bullets, the primers, and everything else relatively affordably. The other option is if you want to tune the accuracy in your particular load for your particular rifle, and that's a major interest, and predominantly why most people take up reloading is because they want to get smaller groups. Maybe they want to shoot further, longer distances, and they're looking for greater accuracy from their rifle. So what do we need? Reloading, it's not rocket science. There are lots of tools here that could be a bit daunting if you haven't seen them before, and you see all this stuff that comes in the big kit and wonder what it's all for. The most basic one to start off with is something that has been really popular in the US, and it's the Lee loader. And that is pretty much everything you will ever need to reload your, in this case, a 243. Oh, sorry, 270. The Lee loader is very, very basic. It only neck sizes, so it requires that you use brass that you fired in your rifle. As I mentioned, not all size 9s are the same, neither are all 270 chambers. The operation is very simple, and you'll bear with me, I'm one-handed. The case is dropped into the die, and it's whacked in with a wooden mallet, and it's as simple as that. This forces the neck into a sized part of the die here, which compresses the neck back down to factory spec. Doesn't change the overall length, doesn't change the body, and it's very, very basic. To get the case out, they give you a pin. This pin will knock the case out. There's another pin to knock the primer out. I forget which order you do that in. I think primer first, then knock the case through. Then this particular tool is to hold a primer here, and you put the body back on there with the case in it, and the pin again, knock it through, and forces the primer back up into this. It can be a bit scary when you're whacking a live round with a wooden mallet, but it does work. It's extremely effective, and they are very cheap. And one of the other benefits of this is all of your bits and bobs can fit in a shoebox, including your primer, your bullets, your powder, everything in one box. That is the most basic end of reloading, and it will get you up and running. I actually started doing that with a 270 when I first took up reloading, and I was still able to reduce the size of the groups that I was getting from Norma factory ammunition down to a much smaller group, just by fine-tuning the seating depth, the load, the charge, the powder, the bullet, and all the various other things. So, covered dies a little bit. What do they all do? So you'll see there's a 3-die kit here. 2-die kits are fairly standard. That's what the bare minimum you'll get. In this case, you have a full-length sizing die. This is the one, as I mentioned, is going to size everything. It's going to do the neck. It's going to push the shoulder back. How much that die changes the length of the case is up to you, and this collar is the thing that determines how deep that die goes in to the press. This happens to be my press on a very handy MDF box. This is an example of someone else's who also put it on a nice box. They don't need to be bolted to a bench, and it can be filed away under the stairs or whatever, and not take up loads of space. I'll go through setting up the full-length die in a second. This is a 4-die kit. It's a Lee kit. Lee is probably the most affordable brand out there for products. This 4-die kit's about £55. Covers everything you could possibly need. It's a full-length sizing die, very similar to the Forster one. You have a seating die. Again, that would make up the 2 dies of your 2-die set. The thing they have, which is, in my opinion, one of the better dies on the market, is a collet neck sizing die. One of the benefits of this particular die is it doesn't require any lube. Lube is required for most full-length sizing dies just to stop the case getting stuck inside. You are, in effect, forcing a piece of brass inside a piece of steel, and it can get stuck, which is a major pain in the hoop. The 4th die in here is a factory crimp die. You'll see the collet in the top here. The neck of the case goes into that collet, and as you force the die up, this part of the collar here is forced inside, squeezes the collet, and you crimp the outside of the neck around the bullet. There are lots of other things that you could get, but you don't necessarily need. For example, that's a body die. It, as the name suggests, only sizes the outside of the case. So it would be sizing this section of the case only, not the shoulder, not the neck. It can be quite helpful, and this is a prime example. This is a case that has a belt. The belt here is unique, and there are 3 types or main types of bottleneck cartridge in a centerfire form, and the three would be rimless, which is your standard, the likes of the 243, 270, 308, treble 2, all those. This one clearly has a rim, like a shotgun cartridge. This cartridge head space is on the rim, not on a datum point on the neck. So this case cannot go any deeper into the chamber when the primer is struck by the firing pin. Similarly, this one is a 300 Win mag. It's a belted case. Belted cases were very popular back in the 1900s, 1920s. Their illusion was that these were safer in hot countries because the rounds didn't get stuck in the chamber. If you were shooting anything that was, remotely dangerous using large cartridges like this, then a belted case was what they were formed on. All of the big things like 375 Holland, and this particular one, the 300 Win mag, is based on that case. These belts again stop the case going into the chamber and limit the cartridge going down to the shoulder when you pull the trigger and the primer goes off. Those ones, the rimmed and belted, are slightly different to reload for. I'm going to focus on these because in my opinion they have a very different way of setting the dies up that you need to pay attention to. So we'll get rid of those and stick with these. Other than the die, you've got a press. This is what's called a single stage press, and made by a company called RCBS. It's one of the better brands out there. The press consists of an arm and a ram that goes up. The shell holders that sit within that ram will take any case depending on the shell holder. Get the right size. Drop my pen, excuse me. Get the right size for your case, and the case will sit in there, and it's held in place. It cannot be lifted up and down. It just it sits in there and slides side to side. All presses tend to have the same thread pitch and diameter, so they'll take any brand of press. You don't have to stick to a particular brand of die to get this press to work. And it's very simple. It's got a cantilever system to allow you to put quite a bit of force into that ram as you push it up. This feature here is just to catch used primers, and other than that, you are looking at case conditioning equipment. So the tools here, they all have a slightly different function. This one very simply is for cleaning out the back end of the case when you remove the primer, and it takes all the old hard carbon out. The most fundamental one in this list, which is something that I would say is a must-have for anybody who's considering reloading, is a trimmer. Now, this kit consists of a lock stud and a shell holder, which is specific to this case. In this particular case, it's treble 2. This cutter, which has it's got 4 fairly sharp edges to it, which will trim the neck, the length of the neck. The lock stud and the cutter and this gauge here all tie in. So when the case has got no primer in it, this pin will go right through and it'll bottom out on this piece of metal here. So that is measured, and it's a very specific distance, and it corresponds, this is a different cartridge, but it corresponds to the maximum trim length. So this here is quite handily put on your Lee die paperwork. It tells you exactly how long your cartridge needs to be, and it's for good reason. In the same way that if you've got a shotgun, it's probably got a 2 3/4 inch chamber. If you put 3-inch chambered or 3-inch cartridges in it, when it goes off in a shotgun, the crimp will open up and it'll be inside this area. Now obviously that's only the width of the bullet. In the shotgun it's the width of the wad and the the bore of 12 bore, 20 bore, whatever. In terms of rifling, if your case is too long and it sits here, now it could still chamber because of your headspace dimension. If you then pull the trigger, the bullet is trying to squeeze past a piece of the neck, which is actually narrower than the bore of the rifle itself, and that can create a huge pressure spike. So trimming your brass to length is quite important. The beauty of this one is if it's the right length, nothing comes off. If it's too short, it doesn't matter. It won't take any more off. The disadvantage of something like this, for example, which is the Forster trimmer, it has the same cutter here. The case is held in here. You need to set this to a specific length. So if you cock up and you've set your trimmer too short and you've just whizzed off 3mm of the neck, you're looking to buy some new brass, because now that brass is no good. So I quite like the Lee stuff. It's very simple, it's idiot proof, and if you're on here tonight, then you're probably not a bench rest reloader, so I'll class myself in the idiot class, because I've over trimmed things in the past and it's irritating. So these are roughly about 10 quid for all the bits that you could possibly need to get this the right length, to make sure you're not going to have any problems with cases being too long. Once you've trimmed your case, it's going to have two very sharp sides, inside and outside. You've used a flat blade to cut the top of the case here by inserting a chamfer tool, either this one, which is I think it's an RCBS, does the inside chamfer. You're not trying to create a point here. All you're doing is removing the burr, so when you seat the bullet, you're not getting any constriction, which might give you variable tension in the neck or pressure when you pull the trigger and the primer goes off. Pointy end goes inside, and there's another end to do the outside, so you've got nice smooth neck on the case. That's the Lee version. It's about 25% cheaper, or 25% of the price of anything from anyone else. Lee stuff, as I say, is pretty affordable. So those are the bare minimum for the case conditioning. There are lots of other things you could buy, and don't get me wrong, I'd be delighted to sell them, but ultimately you don't need them. This is basic reloading. All you're trying to do is start a new hobby, increase your accuracy of the rifle, and hopefully cut some costs. The trimmer has a few features that you can have, where you have a ball to save you the hassle of holding this and turning it. What I actually do is I tend to put this inside a cordless drill, and you can do cases very quickly, whiz them into the case, into the cordless drill, stick that in. It's either trimmed or it's not. If it's not, it's fine. You don't have to chamfer because you haven't taken anything off, and you're done. So you're left with a case that's ultimately ready to go. The majority of the time I do this when it's been sized. So this is a process that I would do after it's been sized. In sizing the case, you always get a little bit of lengthening. You can't squeeze the brass without it going somewhere, and ultimately if you're squeezing that shoulder down there and that neck in there, you're going to get some growth on the overall length of the case itself. So you've probably, looking to start reloading, you've probably got a bucket of brass that you've fired from factory stuff. It's all got a primer in like this. It's all the same brand, ideally. Don't reload with mixed brass. The main reason for that is in the same sense that this has a wall thickness. The difference between RWS and Norma or Tika or Sacco or Lapua or any other brand of brass, the thickness in the wall is going to be different. That creates a different internal volume, and as the volume is critical to the pressure that you're going to get, and we're trying to get consistency here, we want to use the same brand. Ideally, once fired or has had the same number of firings, because again you're going to have had different wall thicknesses and different internal volumes. So what do we do to get started? Let's assume that I've got a case to go in here. I've got a full-length die. Now if you read the instructions, and the Lee instructions are here, it's a huge sheet of instructions that will tell you how to set up your die. It's very basic for full-length sizing. It is literally drop the ram handle on your press, screw the die in here until it hits the press, back the press off and turn the die a little bit further in to lock it up. So I'm down to here. It's not going to work one-handed. I'll have to do this with the camera crew next time. Screw the die in. Hopefully this will bottom out. Hang on. If you undo the locking collar, it allows me to screw the die in. So you'll see that it's bottomed out there. It's hitting the shell holder on the ram, and it can't go any further. If I release the ram, it allows me to keep turning it. Now the instructions for Lee will tell you to knock it a quarter of a turn, eighth of a turn, and then when you pull the handle down, it will bottom out. It's actually hitting the die, but it's not able to go any further. This one's got a little bit of slack in it, so bottom out a bit more, and that's the press bottoming out. Now some presses will allow you to what they call cam over, where the arm will hit a fixed point, and it still can go that last bit, and it just goes past the point of the central point of these arms and where the linkages are. I'm not sure that's necessary. You're not actually compressing the thing anymore. All you're doing is stressing all the joints in your press, but what you are doing is getting a repeatable point where you've sized that case into this die. So once you've set the die up like that to the instructions, that's it bottoming out again. The lock ring can be adjusted on this particular brand. This lock ring has a little grub screw which allows you to tighten it up so that when you take the die out, the lock ring doesn't move. It stays where you are. You know it's repeatable. You can do that every single time. My problem with that particular method of setting the die up is it doesn't account for the different size 9 shoes. Your 243 die and your 243 chamber may be opposite ends of the tolerance for 243. So if you have a particularly large chamber and a die which is at the lower end of the tolerance for setting up 243, your brass is now going to be sized much more, i.e. it's going to be smaller than the chamber itself. Now that can create headspace issues just by sizing them. It's unusual because most manufacturers' tolerance is very good and they will cut chambers that are in the middle of the spec, but it can happen. What I've started advising people to do is, instead of just going down to the full extent of the ram here, where it hits the ram, that's the die bottoming out, the lock ring still has somewhere to go. I start the sizing process there. So if I put a piece of 243 brass into it's not a 243 shell holder, but I'll give you an idea of what the case is going to look like. You slip in the case in there. It's not a 243, obviously. I'm going to size that to the minimum amount of sizing I can do, and that's because it's hit the shell holder. I would even back that off slightly so that I'm barely knocking the shoulder back at all. I'll then try and put that into my chamber. If it's stiff to chamber, then obviously it needs to be sized more. Come back, do it again. Give the die a quarter turn. Do it again. Put it in the chamber. And keep doing that, repeating that process. So you're sizing the case little by little, and you are literally doing it by thousandths of an inch on the neck, on the shoulder rather, which is limiting the chambering. As soon as you get a smooth chamber with no effort, I would personally prefer to have my brass at that point. It's the least amount that you can work the brass, and it means when you are coming to do this for the 10th, 11th, 12th time, that you don't end up with brass that has been resized over and over and over again. If you keep sizing them smaller than they need to be, you'll get the growth at the neck, and then you're going to trim that off. Every time you do that, you're losing some of the volume of the brass in this case. If you keep doing that, say you've done the absolute maximum sizing you can do, so this case is growing and growing and growing, and you've trimmed, let's say, that much brass off, it doesn't show because all the brass is flowing up from the thick part in the bottom of this case where you saw it before in the web where it is needed, and you start getting thinner and thinner walls. When you get to that point, you can get serious issues where the ring here will show every time you fire, and it's because it's getting thinner and thinner. And if you actually bend a paperclip and put it down the inside, you can feel the ridge on the inside where it's getting worn away. Now, I've had several cases in the past, especially with belted ones like this, where they've separated and this part of the head has come off the case in the chamber. Other than being rather scary, it's also quite difficult to get that thing out of the chamber because it's now got no edges for you to pull on or push out. Most rifles are of significant design. They're not going to breach. You're not going to get any issues, but it is a problem if you keep sizing the brass to the point where you're having to trim it each time and remove more and more material. That material is coming from somewhere. So my personal viewpoint is size that case to the bare minimum you can. So it just chambers in your rifle. Doesn't necessarily mean it'll chamber in someone else's rifle, but it's working the brass the least amount. The process of full-length sizing, in most cases, as you can see up the inside of this die, it has a pin. Now that pin has a very specific sized expander ball on it. In this case it's 243, so the expander ball is going to be 0.02 of an inch smaller than the 243 bullet, so that when you've done it, this case is obviously tight and it takes some force to seat the bullet. If you imagine the case going in, it will go in over the expander ball, because obviously there's got lots of space there. Even this being a 270, it's even going to go in. The neck is going to hit the inside of the die, which is the same size and shape as the rifle chamber, but narrower. It's going to compress it more than it needs to, so that you're probably 3 or 4 thousandths of an inch less than the diameter of the bullet. And then when you pull the case out, it's expanded back to its standard size, down to that 2 thou less than the bullet size. So you've compressed it and now you're expanding it again. And bearing in mind you've already fired it, so it's expanded, then you're sizing it, it's compressed, and then it's expanded again. So that's 3 cycles that brass neck has been through. And if you imagine, bending a fork or any metal, if you keep bending it, it will break, and that's no different to brass. So it's one of the reasons that you will get a certain lifespan out of your brass, depending on how hot your loads are, how many firings you do, the reloading process that you go through, and how you size things. If you size them to the size of your chamber, the minimum amount of sizing, and you're not running massively hot loads, you can quite happily get 10-12 firings out of a premium brass. This is Norma. It's actually quite a soft brass. I see that as quite a positive thing. It allows you to do all those firings and resizings and reloadings without the need to anneal the case. The annealing, which you can see in this case, for example, this is something that the factory have done. When they produce the brass, it comes from a brass coin. It's just literally a flat solid. It's then forced into a cup, and that cup is forced into various other shapes, depending on the size and shape of the dimensions of this particular cartridge. This pit, they want to be quite soft. Obviously it needs to expand when you force the bullet into it, it needs to expand when you pull the trigger, and it needs to be elastic when you resize it. So this part of the neck has been heated up, and you can see the line where the heat has been applied. It's just the neck and shoulder that's been done, because those are the parts that they want to expand and be elastic. The rest of the case they want to be solid and hard, mainly because, as you saw in the chamber here, you've got part of your case protruding from the end of the chamber. So that part of the case needs to support all of the pressure that you're putting through your particular cartridge. Now, in the case of things like 270, 243, you're looking at 60,000 psi at the upper end, the limit of that chambering. So that brass has to be very supportive and very hard, but this bit here needs to be very soft and elastic. So we've got our used case. We've set our die up so it's just about big enough for you to size the brass so it just fits in your chamber. The one thing I missed, before we've actually put the case into this die when it's on the press, because it's a full length sizing die, you do need to lube. So there are various things that you can do. These lube pads, literally just squirting the lube in, running the case in there, it applies a little bit of the wax. This particular brand you can do by hand, same with the Hornady one-shot wax. Just putting some on your fingers and rubbing the neck of the case is enough to do it. The manufacturers will suggest you get a cotton bud, or you can have little bore brushes. Same thing, lube the inside. When that case goes into the inside of the die, the outside of the neck is going to be forced into that steel die. It needs to be lubed or it's going to get stuck. Again, when you pull it out and it goes back over the expander ball, the inside of that neck needs to be lubed or it's going to get stuck. And if they get stuck, it is a pain, because you've actually locked up your press because your case is stuck in the shell holder. It's also stuck in the die, so it's actually quite tricky to remove the whole thing to allow you to get to the case to pull it out. The dies themselves are normally set up from the factory. You can see this one has got the depriming pin protruding through the bottom. It doesn't really matter how far that goes through, so long as when the die is fully seated in the press and the ram is up, that it's pushing through the case enough to push that used primer out. So here you can see this tray has collected the primers that are coming through. They're being spat out on the downstroke of the arm, and this particular press has a little window through the back here. The primers come through and they get caught in the box here. So you're left with a case that has been sized. The neck is now smaller than the bullet, so it can accept the bullet and grip it tightly enough. You've knocked the shoulder back so it can chamber, and you're left with this without a primer, if I can find one. Let's use this one. This one's not been fired. If you saw the primer pocket here after the primer's been removed, you'll find that it's usually black, full of carbon, and needs a bit of cleaning. You can use the primer pocket tool, which has a fairly blunt edge to it. It's enough just to knock the carbon off. You don't really need to do that, in my opinion. You can get away with just seating the primer, but over time you're going to get a lot of carbon in there, and it can get in the way. It's going to cause inconsistent flash and burn from the primer, and just to make sure everything's uniform and is capable of giving you a uniform burn with every primer, every time you pull the trigger, you're trying to remove all the inconsistencies. So it's a very quick process to clean that primer out. Now you've got your deprimed, cleaned brass. If you have full length sized it, it's going to be covered in lube. You want to get rid of that before you do anything else. Now, most lube is water soluble. Bit of soap and water will get it off. Some lubes are wax based. You can wipe them off. Various other things that can be used for resizing lube, but they all need to be removed, mainly because you're about to introduce a powder based substance and a bullet that the seating depth and neck tension are critical to the accuracy of the round. So if you've got lube inside this neck and less lube inside the other neck, you're going to get the neck tension, and the release point of that bullet is going to be different. So clean all the cases after you've lubed them, which is one more reason why I actually quite like neck sizing. There's no lube involved, so not only have I had not had to lube them before I've sized them, I've not had to clean them afterwards. They're ready to go. It's knocked the primer out, I've cleaned the carbon out. You can go one step further. There are various kits for cleaning the brass so that it comes out extremely shiny, whether it's a tumbler with walnut corn cob media or anything like that. Some of the stainless steel pin-based tumblers are very good. It looks nice. I'm not entirely sure it adds anything to the accuracy of your reloaded ammunition. It is just more stuff for you to buy, which you're more than welcome to come in and buy. So, deprime case, all the right size. What do we do next? You've got a variety of priming tools. This is a very basic single. Yes, I know Maury likes lube. Thanks for the comments. Very simple vintage single primer. The primers come usually in trays of 100. This one in CCI. It doesn't matter how they look, whether they're the right way up or not. They're single fed into this particular primer, and you literally take the case, seat it in the priming tool like that, and squeeze the handle. The primer that you've seated in the hole, obviously with the anvil, the yellow part that you can see is the inside of the primer, the shiny silver bit is the outside. You've put it in the priming tool with the anvil and the yellow part sticking up, because that's going to be the inside of the case, and you are just squeezing the handle. Now this one's got a primer in already. The tension of you doing this, you can feel, you'll get to know what feels normal. If it goes in too easily or it's too stiff to close on the primer, then you may have to look at uniforming the pocket of the brass. But on the whole, you won't necessarily need to pay too much attention to the pocket of the brass. It's they're fairly uniform in most brands. The brands, this is a Federal factory case. The blue ring around the primer is one of their trademarks. Federal brass, very good brass. No reason why you can't just take any of your used factory brass that you've got sitting in a bucket under the stairs or wherever. They'll all reload. Doesn't matter whether it's PPU, Federal, or whether you want to splash out and buy a nice new shiny box of Lapua brass, which is brand new unfired brass when they come in. Similarly, we get a lot of this in from some of the volume users, whether it's target clubs or contractors. It's single-use factory brass. They're not allowed to use reloads on any of the contracts, and we buy it in bulk and sell it. It's very affordable. It's usually about 20 quid for 100. Some of the more premium brands, the likes of Norma, for example, you can expect to pay anywhere between 30 and 40 quid 100. 100 cases will normally see most people, and it gives you a good lot of cases to work with. It's no coincidence there's 100 primers in a primer tray. Bullets normally come in boxes of 100. So having 100 cases will allow you to load all of them, fire them all once, put them in a bucket and say they're all twice fired, and keep a tab on how many times you've fired that brass, because it will degrade over time, and you will see some of the things like how easy it is to put the primer in, how hard it is to seat the bullet, and various things like that as the brass gets harder or the primer pockets get slacker. So we've primed the case. Assume this has got a live primer in, and obviously it won't have the indentation from the primer, from the firing pin in it, and you've got a piece of brass ready to be charged with powder. So what do we do next? We've got a huge range of powder companies. It's just two of the ones that we have, both European. There were some restrictions on some of the powders that we had access to in the UK. The particularly well-known ones like Vargit and Hodgson's 4350 and 4831. These are all just code numbers for different burn rates of powder. Different cartridges have different requirements for the amount of pressure and the speed with which that pressure curve is built up in the case. So if you choose a powder, choose one that you can source locally, or you're not going to have to travel 500 miles to get, that you can get regular stock of. Most of the powders that we have in the UK, we can get them fairly regularly, and there are probably 4 or 5 big brands. All of these producers have either paper-based manuals like this one, so Reload Swiss, you can get a book of load data, but actually what's probably easier to use is the online load data. I always advise people to get the load data from the powder manufacturer rather than the bullet manufacturer, on the basis that the thing that you're trying to control is the volume of a substance that they produce. I would say they know more about it than the people who are building bullets, but I'm sure there are lots of people who disagree. So if we look at this one, for example, you've got the Reload Swiss website. It's very easy to get into. You can see the load data link, click the thing, put in your cartridge. You can choose whether you want to put grains or grams. If you're in continental Europe, a lot of their weights are in grams. The bullet manufacturer, you can whittle this down to a variety of brands. Choose the one if you've got a particular bullet in mind. It doesn't matter whether you're looking at any of the big producers. They will usually have a corresponding bullet on the list. If they don't, that's not the end of the world, and I'll show you why. So let's just say, for example, we have chosen a bullet. I'll go with a Sierra here. This particular website gives you a variety of powder options that you could use. So they're all 70 grain there, and it's recommending that you could have any one of those 3 powders that Reload Swiss produce. For this example, I'm going to use Vitavuri. Same deal. They have a reloading data page. It covers all of the cartridges you could possibly want. and if it doesn't, then there are lots of places you can find that data. They will list a particular bullet weight and a particular bullet type and brand. If we choose, given that we're looking at 243, so we've got two here. I'll go with this one here. So you've got two different bullets, a Sierra Full Metal Jacket and a Lapua Naturalis. They're both 90 grains. Let's say you've chosen a Sierra Game Changer. Well, that's not a Full Metal Jacket, so what do I do? Well, you just load it like every other 90 grain bullet. It's not rocket science, and if you actually look at the numbers, there's no significant difference between this particular powder N540, their starting load of 33.5 or 34.9 or 35. Let's stick with those two, because those two are two significantly different bullets. One is a monolithic non-lead bullet, and the other is just a standard jacketed cup and core target bullet. So if I'm starting with one of these, I'm shown the velocities that I can expect to get from any one of these powders in that bullet choice, and you can get a very good idea if you've been shooting factory ammunition. Let's say you've been shooting, I don't know, Sacco Gamehead 90 grain. It says on the box what velocity they're coming out at. You can expect that the people who are producing ammunition are sending them out at velocities that are accurate, and they are accurate in a number of rifles. So that's the kind of target area you want to get yours to, rather than starting down here, which is 2750. There are numerous ways that you can go about doing choosing the charge level. I've put this onto a printed format so you can see it's the same thing. It's basically straight off that page: Lapua, Sino, and Naturalis, and it's giving you. We'll go with N540. This one here. It's the second in the list, and you are looking at the difference between 34.9. Sorry, the printer ran out. That's why it's gone brown. 34.9 and 35 as your starting load data. Now they're telling me that gives me 2750 or 2822, depending on which bullet you've got. There's not much in it. The max for both of those is also very similar. You're looking at 39 or 39.2. Now on the whole, you're not going to be able to measure accurately less than 0.2 of a grain, mainly because a lot of the scales, and there's an example, they don't measure to that level of accuracy. The types of scales that are available are quite wide-ranging. The very cheap ones aren't necessarily bad. They're often beam scales like this one here. The beam will allow you to add more powder to the pan at the back there and measure it off, moving the ball along till you know where your weight is, and the pointer is pointing at the silver part on the scale there. Assuming you've got a reliable weighing source, you can then jump in and start weighing out powder. But where do you start? So that's quite a big range. I've got 34, call it 35 freeze, up to 39. So that's a 4 grain spread. Now, if my factory stuff is giving me velocities of let's say 3050, I know that the majority of the accuracy in this particular cartridge is going to be at the upper end of this range of velocities. So my personal view is, do I want to set out a load table that starts at 35 and go through all this list with 5 rounds of each? Now, you may like shooting groups, but at 36 quid a box of 50, I'm not sure I want to waste 50 rounds just trying to find a load. So if I'm aiming to be at the upper end of this velocity, I'm going to try and do it with the development end up here. So my particular method, and you can choose your own, there are lots of other ways of doing this, is these shots, I'm only putting them through because I'm trying to evaluate whether there's any pressure. If I've got too much pressure, I know that I've done something wrong. But ultimately, I'm not looking for accuracy down at this level, because I don't want a 243 that's shooting at 2750. Now, bearing in mind that this data is probably coming out of a 26-inch barrel, you might have a 20-inch barrel, you can expect that to be 2.5, not 2.7. So I'm looking for accuracy up here. I want an effective deer legal round. The shots I'm taking on these charge levels are very low. So I'm probably halfway through. I've put this one in brackets because I might actually start looking for a group. Now this could be 3, could be 5, could be 10 if you want. It doesn't really matter, but I can normally see what turns into an accurate load fairly easily from 3 shots. The size of those groups tend to start shrinking as you go through, and you'll find what they call a node in this range somewhere. So for this purpose of this equation, we're going to go with this one and say this is the accurate one. We've shot lots of groups. We've done it on paper, so you can see, you can refer to them, you can file them, you can release your inner nerd and store it in a folder for your reloading pleasure. I'm going to fill my cases with these, and we'll go to the shooting after I've gone to the seating of the bullet, which obviously I haven't done yet. In your little loading tray here, I would lay out a row where there's 1, and then the next row along to when you get down to here, you've got 3. Now, for my own peace of mind, I tend to write on the case. Having filled a box of ammunition with a full range of different charges and gone to the range to lift it up and the lid to come off and them all to fall on the floor, and all of the different charges are now mixed up, and I had to go home and pull all the bullets. It's much easier if you just write on the case. You know exactly what you've got, and when you've done enough of these, if you get distracted, you can come back and you know exactly which one you were on. You haven't put in 2 charges because it's not possible. So I've laid these all out, written on all the cases, it's all ready to go. How you weigh the powder is entirely up to you. There are very basic scales like these. They're not very expensive. They are actually pretty accurate. There are very expensive scales which will dispense the powder for you. Beam scales like this from Lee, they just, as you fill the pan up, you can adjust the scale to measure the amount you want, and once the pointer is dead center on the marker there, you know you've got the right amount. So the simple thing then is you've got your powder funnel, all your cases are sitting nicely in your little tray. Powder funnel, pour the powder in. These strange devices are powder throwers, which I have to say have saved me an awful lot of time, and actually they are pretty accurate. The hopper is filled with powder. As you turn the powder thrower arm around to this point, this section is filling with powder. When you turn it back, the powder comes out the nozzle at the bottom. Now you can either use that to throw it into a pan to weigh the powder, or you can put it straight into the case. If you've got to the point where you've got a consistent weight being thrown, there's nothing to stop you loading those straight into the case. The variance in them is marginal, and I've developed some very accurate powder where I'm literally only weighing the 1 or 2 from the scales. The benefit of these is you can whiz through 100 cases in no time at all, weighing every 10th one, just to give you some consistency that there's no problems with the weight. Once you've got your measures out there, each case is in your little tray, marked, ready to go. What next? So you've got a bullet seating die, same deal. The ring on this is allowing you to set the die at a particular length, and that length corresponds to the length of the round. So each round has a factory length, or an overall chamber length. Now this length is predetermined by the specification of the chamber. It's written in books everywhere. This one is the maximum overall length, and you can see here it says 2.71 inches or 68.63 mils. So they have given you the length that they loaded theirs to. So 2.689, 68.3. So you're slightly under the overall length, although there seems to be some difference between the figures on there. Oh no, that's not too bad. So long as you're not over that length. In terms of where to start, I would always start at factory length. It's the easiest way to do it. You know that you're not putting any pressure constraints on your particular load. It's the maximum allowable length before you're hitting the lands of the rifle, and it's the place to start, in my opinion. If you go much longer, your bullet is going to be the widest part of the bullet is going to be seated into the rifling or touching the lands of the rifling, and you've got no free bore at all for that bullet to move before it hits the rifling. Without knowing what charge level you're at already, that's not the place to start, because you can get pressure spikes from that, and it's much safer to start with a factory load, factory length. So the way to set your die up is same as before. I'll get rid of this. Screws in. If you go right to the bottom here, you could quite easily find that when you seat the bullet, it's too deep. So what I like to do usually is back this off so you've got lots of headroom. You're putting your case with your new powder charge in there. It's the wrong shell hole, but never mind. And you seat the bullet by hand. It'll usually sit just in the neck. If it doesn't, you can hold on to it, and as it goes in, once it's supported by the bottom of the die, you can let go, get your fingers out of the way because it does hurt, and draw the case up into the die with the handle. You'll feel the restriction as it hits the seating pin on the inside of this, and if you withdraw it, you'll see how far the bullet has been seated. Now the easiest way to do that is to measure the overall length of that cartridge. One of the most basic ways of doing it is with a set of calipers, which I can't find. There they are. And you can measure the overall length from the head of the case at the fat end to the tip of the bullet. Now the purists will be twitching and scratching their eyes out at the moment, because they're all saying, oh, that's not the overall length because the tip of the bullet could be slightly dented on a soft point or a ballistic tip or whatever. Yes, it could, but for the purposes of this, we're not going to get into measuring the consistent datum point of the bullet, which is usually referred to as the ogive or ogive. It's to give you a minimum, or rather a maximum overall length of that cartridge. The shape of this bullet is going to impact how far away this part is to the lands. But if you recall from your chamber diagram, you might have a 308. If you're loading 130 grain 308, you've got millimeters of space between the fat end of the bullet and the lands on that rifling. If you start pushing that bullet out further and further and further, you're going to have much less of the neck holding on to the fat part of the bullet. If I try and get this out one-handed. So you want the bullet to sit in the neck of that case, so that at least one diameter or one caliber width is sitting. So for example, if this is a 6mm bullet, you want at least 6 mils of the straight section of this bullet sitting in this, so that you can imagine you've got a square section 6 mils wide, 6 mils long. That's the bare minimum you would want in that. And on this, we are going to load these to factory length, so I'm probably going to end up seating that. This bullet doesn't correspond to that case, but you'll get the picture. The bullet may go down into the powder column. It may be past the neck, it may not, depending on the case and the bullet and the cartridge that you're loading. So once you've got a measurement point on here, I prefer to use the die screwing it down, rather than what they have on this particular one is you can adjust the top of the die and release the plunger inside to allow you to seat it more or less. That to me doesn't work, because once I've set this die up, I want it to be the same each time, and I'd much rather have this ring being the limitation of how far this die goes down than this point where I can adjust the top of the die. So you can see if I turn this, the die stays still. This is the pin coming further out, and it allows me to lengthen the overall length of that cartridge or reduce it by adjusting this. I've got no micrometer or any measurement ability on this, so let's say I put it away in the box like that, and when it comes out I twist it by mistake. I've just put an extra couple of thou on that next loading, and all those cases, all those rounds are going to be shorter than the previous ones because I didn't know where this was sitting. So I'd much rather screw this down on this particular make so that it's locked down. That's it, doesn't go any further, and use the overall seating depth of the die to control your control your seating depth. Yeah, thanks, Scott. The other brands have different ways of controlling the depth of that die. This Forster one has a pin, central pin, which you can lock, which is quite handy. This one has an unusual thing where it holds the case as it seats. It keeps the bullet uniform and centralized to the case as it goes in, and it does give you very consistent rounds. Each manufacturer has their own take on how to seat a bullet, and arguably, as long as the bullet's going in a straight line and the brass has been well prepped and it's uniform, then you shouldn't have any problems. The bullets themselves will stabilize as they go into the neck, even if it comes in at an angle because it's on a boat tail. So, for example, that is a 30 cal bullet. Have I got a 308 here? Let's take that one for example. So as you put the bullet in by hand, it will sit like that until you put it into the press, and it's only when it goes up into the inside of the press that it will straighten up and go down into the neck. But obviously once it gets past that point where a full caliber width has gone in, it can't do anything but straighten up. You will get some variable run out on the bullet. If you were to roll the case like this and put a micrometer on the neck or the bullet, you will see some change in the micrometer as the bullet is maybe slightly out of central position. You also see that on some brass, this one's fairly uniform. The thickness of the neck on a factory case can be slightly off center. You could have slightly more brass on one side than you do on the other. It's quite common in there's a little bit there you can see. It's quite common in cheaper brass. I'm not going to get into things like neck turning of cases because this is a basic reloading course and I don't do it because I really can't be asked when you don't need to do it. So we've done our we've seated all our bullets to length of the factory length, and we're now going to go away and shoot them. How you shoot and where you want to shoot it is really up to you. The only thing I would say is any external variables that are present when you're doing your load development are going to impact your group size. So you're not going to be able to read an accurate figure. Probably not going to read an accurate figure from 3. So if you wanted to do 5, then that's entirely up to you. But for this, let's just say we've gone through these groups and they've started tightening up. You've got to here, and these are the smallest. This is the smallest group, and then maybe at 39 you've gone slightly bigger than that one. I've put this one at the end, despite the fact it's slightly over. You may get to this point and realize that actually these are all going in the same hole. Why do I need to do these? You don't. If you find a group that's single holing at any point in this range, you can adjust. If you want to go 0.2 of a grain increments, feel free. I don't have the time or the powder. Well, I do have the powder, but I don't have the time to go through in those kind of increments to try and find a group, which arguably I'm not going to be able to shoot in the field with the rain running down my neck on a wet night. My primary goal here is to find the point at which these start shrinking. So let's assume it's this one. I might find that in my rifle, this is perfectly acceptable and there's no pressure here at all. The thing I'm looking for when I shoot this one is I'd like to know where the upper limit is on my rifle. Now, they'll tell you never go past the max load. You might find that your max load's here. It's entirely up to you, your rifle, whether you've got a tighter chamber, a thicker brass. Maybe the bullet has a much longer shank. It creates more pressure in the chamber, all the things that might be impacting. This is a guide. So you're going to have to work up all of these to find out where in your rifle is the most accurate point and where the pressure is going to come in. So here's your accurate one. You've shot a world-class winning group and you're thinking, well, what if I can do better than that? How do I do that? So we've jumped in 0.5 grain increments. bracket those by going either side. Maybe look at going 382, so it's somewhere between the 3.8 you had and the 3.85 you've already shot, and another one at 3.87. I haven't made these 3.825 or 3.875 because none of the equipment that I have measures to that level of accuracy. When you're measuring to plus or minus 0.2 of a grain, and I'm using powder throwers, the volume is more relevant to me, but you will get more inconsistency from neck tension than you will from an extra 2 granules of powder in this particular load over that one. So I've shot these. I don't need to do this one again because I've already done it. So I've gone either side, split the difference to see if there's any accuracy improvement either side of this particular level. Say I shoot these two, and actually 382 grains, 38.2 grains improves the group slightly. Even better. I've got an even better load now. I'm now shooting like a champion. What can you do to better improve that? Now, on the basis that we've set this at factory length, I'm not measuring chambers. I'm not looking for where my lands are. I don't know how many rifles I've got, but I've got lots of rifles. I don't know where any of the lands are. I've never measured them once. The accuracy on the paper is the only thing I'm personally interested in because I haven't got time to start measuring distances from the bolt face to the lands in my rifle. The one thing you may find is that you've got a slightly better group by bracketing the overall length. So we've done this at 68.3 mil. Try slightly smaller. Now this could be 68.2, could be 68.3. I've gone 0.05 of a mil on this just for your purposes. But again, you're going to struggle to measure these accurately unless you've got some kit that we haven't discussed here, which is measuring from the curvature point on the bullet, which if you start measuring bullets to the point where you take this seriously, you'll find that in any box of bullets you will get a bell curve of sizes. There'll be at one end 2 thou less than they should be, and the other end there'll be 2 thou more than they should be, but the majority of your bullets will be in the peak of that curve. If you start measuring ogives and getting into the minutiae of this, you'll be way ahead of anything I can do in one online video for reloading. But you can play around with the lengths. You don't need to jam the bullet into the rifling of any rifle to get an accurate load. And to give you an example of that, this is a group from a factory rifle. It's a Tikka, and it's shooting 175 grain Match Kings in HPS Target Master. They're so far off the lands you could probably stick a hot dog between them. There's nothing in it. That's 3 shots in one hole from a factory rifle in factory ammunition. You don't need to start jamming those in the lands to produce very, very tight